4 years, $80,000 in debt, a degree that tells employers you can sit in a room and follow instructions. Meanwhile, someone who never set foot in a lecture hall just built the thing your professor spent a semester describing. This isn't an accident. This isn't luck. Self-taught people aren't smarter than graduates. They just learned in a way that the brain actually responds to, and once you understand the difference, you will never look at a classroom the same way again. In 1997, a 22-year-old dropped out of Reed College after one semester. He couldn't afford the tuition. He had no plan. He started attending classes he found interesting. Not for credit, not for a degree, just because the information mattered to him. One of those classes was calligraphy. 10 years later, that calligraphy course became the typography system inside the first Macintosh computer. Steve Jobs said it himself in his 2005 Stanford commencement address. You cannot connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backward. Self-taught learners are dot connectors by necessity because nobody told them which dots mattered, so they found the ones that did. Here's the core problem with formal education. The curriculum was designed for the average student, in the average situation, heading toward the average outcome. It was not designed for you. Cognitive psychologist John Sweller developed cognitive load theory in 1988. His finding, the brain has a fixed capacity for processing new information at any one time. When you force it to process irrelevant material, mandatory courses, subjects outside your goal, information with no immediate application, you consume that capacity without building anything useful. Sweller called this extraneous cognitive load. Every hour spent on extraneous load is an hour not spent on germane load. The processing that actually builds skill and understanding. Self-taught learners eliminate extraneous load by default. They don't study the whole map. They study the road they're on. And because every piece of information connects directly to a goal they chose, the brain encodes it as signal, not noise. Edward Deci and Richard Ryan at the University of Rochester spent 30 years studying motivation. Their conclusion, information tied to intrinsic motivation, things you chose, things that matter to you, is encoded up to 3 times more durably than information studied under external pressure. Chosen information is signal, assigned information is noise. The relevance alone won't save you, because knowing what matters doesn't mean you know how to get there fast. The biggest structural advantage self-taught learners have is not what they study. It's how fast they find out they're wrong. In a university, feedback arrives in cycles. Assignment. Wait 2 weeks. Grade. Move on. By the time you find out you misunderstood something, you've built 3 more weeks of understanding on top of the wrong foundation. Self-taught learners operate differently. They build something. It breaks. They fix it immediately. They write code. It doesn't run. They debug in real time. They try a technique. It fails. They adjust before the next attempt. Psychologist John Hattie at the University of Melbourne conducted the largest ever meta-analysis of educational research. 800 studies, 50,000 papers, 250 million students. His single most important finding, feedback is the #1 driver of learning outcomes. Specifically, immediate, specific corrective feedback, not grades, not praise. Correction, fast. Self-taught environments generate this constantly. The project either works or it doesn't. The client either buys or they don't. The audience either engages or they don't. Real-world feedback is brutal. It is also the fastest learning accelerator that exists. If this is new to you, subscribe. Every video on this channel is one system broken all the way down. Here's the mechanism nobody talks about. When you teach yourself something from scratch, with no institution validating you, no professor confirming you're on the right track, no certificate waiting at the end, you develop something graduates rarely build inside a system. You develop a learner identity. Psychologist Carol Dweck at Stanford spent decades studying the difference between people who believe ability is fixed and people who believe it develops. Her finding, people with a growth identity, who define themselves as someone who figures things out, outperform fixed identity learners in every long-term measure, not because they're smarter, because they don't stop when it gets hard. Self-taught learners build this identity by necessity. Every time you figure something out without being shown, your brain logs it. I am someone who can learn this. That log compounds. After 100 self-taught breakthroughs, you don't approach new material with anxiety. You approach it with evidence. Graduates are often taught what to think. Self-taught learners are forced to learn how to learn. That second skill doesn't expire when the subject changes. This isn't an argument against education. It's an argument for understanding what education is actually providing and what it isn't. Degrees provide signal to employers, networks, structured exposure to a field, What they don't reliably provide: intrinsic drive, immediate feedback, learner identity. Those three things are available to anyone. Right now, without tuition, without a campus, the self-taught advantage isn't about skipping school. It's about learning the way your brain actually works, regardless of where you are. But here's where most self-taught learners hit a wall. They have the drive, they have the feedback loops, they have the identity, and then they sit down to actually absorb new material, and the information doesn't stick. Not because they're learning the wrong things, because they haven't built the system for encoding what they find. That's not a motivation problem. That's a memory architecture problem. And the people who solved it weren't academics. They were chess grandmasters. That video is already on this channel.